Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show on MRC TV. Happy Thursday to you. I hope you have had a fantastic week so far. It's been a fantastic week for the truth, by the way. It hasn't exactly been a fantastic week for reporting the truth. Those are two very different things. So that's what I'm here to do today. So one of the most insidious and frustrating aspects about constantly being lied to by the government and by so-called experts and by journalists and the media that we're all supposed to trust is that so much of the time, the original lie that is peddled, whether it's, for example, supposedly evidence-based information about a contagious virus that gets pushed in order to forcibly modify our behavior. And then it turns out that most of it was a giant made up pile of bullcrap, but we only find out about that after all of the damage is done, right? Or, for example, a whole bunch of retired intelligence officials all signing on to a letter claiming that a legitimate news story is Russian disinformation, when it wasn't, in fact. But we were supposed to believe them because they were the experts until it turned out that they lied and that they helped suppress a legitimate news story and that may have actually influenced, say, the 2020 presidential election, for example. And these, of course, are just some of the very, very big lies that have been exposed that we do know about. When it comes to things like COVID, for example, there were narratives that were pushed on a very national public level and given airtime by the mainstream media in order to manipulate our behavior, in order to force outcomes, public outcomes that the powers that be wanted to happen. And it was based on manipulated data or even outright lies, frankly, like, for example, the effectiveness of face masks or the positive benefit of shutting down classrooms for millions of school children that were completely and totally bogus, and we see that now. But there are some lies that were pushed 4 or 5 years ago that a lot of people still believe to this day, because one of the most horrific aspects of being lied to by the powers that be and by the media, or who are supposed to be committed to uncovering the truth, beyond just the loss of public trust, is the fact that so often the lie continues to persist and is even accepted as common social convention even after the truth has come out, even when the narrative has been completely exposed as a lie. As Ronald Reagan once very famously put it, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth even has a chance to put its pants on. And we saw that again and again this week. So let's set the stage here. This is a story that you probably did not hear about this week unless you spend a lot of time over on X and follow a lot of right-leaning journalists over there, because God knows it did not get any mainstream media airtime. Let's set the stage here, give you a little background. So in 2020, there was a study that went viral. It was picked up by every major media outlet that purported that Black babies in the United States were 3 times more likely to die during or shortly after birth when cared for by white doctors, but that their survival rate rose dramatically if they were cared for by Black doctors. So the gist here, the suggestion, the insinuation was that white doctors are racially predisposed against Black children, if not just outright racist against them, and are just letting Black babies die, while Black doctors are more likely to care about the welfare of these children and offer them better medical care. And like I said, this was immediately picked up and screamed from the rafters of pretty much every major media outlet. And this was in August of 2020. You recall what was going on in August of 2020. This was when Black Lives Matter riots were still raging across much of the United States. There were race-baiting politicians and, professional activists fueling the racial division and the hatred and profiting very handsomely off of it, by the way. We had Black Lives Matter leaders getting rich off of donation money and buying multi-million-dollar properties in Beverly Hills and parking their brand new Lamborghinis in front of it. And we had left-wing politicians who were running entire campaigns on this narrative and raking in tons and tons of dough. So the media and the Democrat politicians and the professional protesters, they all had a vested interest at the time in anything that they could grab onto that could possibly substantiate this claim that America and all of our institutions are systemically racist against Black people, including our medical community. So CNN published a report at the time, back in August of 2020, that was based on this study, suggesting that these callous white doctors, are responsible for all of these black children dying in droves thanks to racism. So here's what CNN published at the time. The mortality rate of black newborns in hospital shrunk by between 39% and 58% when black physicians took charge of the birth, according to the research, which laid bare how shocking racial disparities in human health can affect even the first hours of a person's life. By contrast, the mortality rate for white babies was largely unaffected by the doctor's race. So you see how the reporting goes, right? They're citing this study, but they're reporting it as though it must be correct. There must not be any error in it whatsoever. And kind of this idea that it just goes to show what all of us already knew, which is that the medical community, as one of America's chief institutions, is systemically racist against black people. And this report and many, many, many others like it were published by all of these news channels. ABC, NBC, MSNBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times. Every leftist rag you can imagine picked this up because, again, the goal, particularly at this time, was to pour gasoline on the fires, the literal fires in many cases, but the fires of racial division in this country. Now, all of this was based on a single study that had come out from George Mason University, where some researchers had crunched the data on about 1.8 million hospital births in Florida between 1992 and 2015. And the study claimed that based on these numbers, black infants were 3 times more likely to die during or shortly after birth when cared for by white doctors than by black ones. Those findings were then published in a medical journal called Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, PNAS. I'm not even kidding you. That's the actual acronym here, PNAS. And it immediately launched this wave of leftists who were screaming that this just went to prove that black babies are being shamelessly neglected and even killed thanks to all of these racist white obstetricians, because America's medical system, just like everything else, is rigged against black people, just like our police system, just like our justice system, just like our housing system, just like our food distribution, our water, even the air we breathe. Everything is racist. And this fed directly into not just the preferred narrative to this day, but particularly the preferred narrative at the time following the death of George Floyd and everything that was going on. And this study was run by every major news outlet, whose articles, by the way, are still live today. You can Google them and find them completely untouched without even so much as an editor's note. Business Insider, Daily Mail, USA Today, The Guardian, outlets across the globe were picking up this study. The World Economic Forum actually published an article, which is, again, still up, by the way, where they talked to the lead author of this study, a guy named Brad Greenwood. He's an associate professor at George Mason University, who told them that black children were more likely to die under the care of white doctors, likely thanks to social factors and cumulative racial and socioeconomic disadvantages of black pregnant women, and that it may be that black physicians are more aware and attuned to these challenges than white physicians. That was his analysis. That was his assumption based on his findings. He said that other factors may include black and white newborns being treated differently because of, quote, spontaneous racial bias, and challenges in assessing and allocating the doctors that black mothers actually want. In essence, white doctors, even if subconsciously, are inherently racist and must be dismissive of what black mothers and infants actually need. That was his conclusion. And this was published by the World Economic Forum, who picked this up and ran with it like it was the gospel as spoken by Jesus Christ himself. This is the NGO that hosts annual summits, by the way, that are attended by leaders from across the globe, including presidents of the United States. And this was given a ton of oxygen on an international stage. This study became such a prevalent link in this chain of the racism narrative. It was even cited by Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her dissent in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which was the very famous case from 2023, in which the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that race-based affirmative action was unconstitutional. That vote was 6-3. Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson all dissented. And in her dissent, Jackson cited the amicus brief that had been filed by the Association of American Medical Colleges that relied especially on this study. It read in part that for high-risk Black newborns, having a Black physician is tantamount to a miracle drug. It more than doubles the likelihood that the baby will live. Yet due to the enduring and significant underrepresentation of minorities in the health professions, many minority patients will not receive care from a racially diverse team or from providers who were trained in a diverse environment. So the argument here being that universities like Harvard and other institutions that train doctors need to be able to admit people based on the color of their skin and not their merit, not their grades, but their race, because if we don't have enough Black doctors, Black babies are going to die. Black babies are going to be dependent on racist white doctors. So we need to train up more Black doctors, regardless of whether they have to be given a leg up to get into college, because otherwise they wouldn't make the cut, because otherwise all of these Black babies are going to die. It's not about how good the doctor actually is, how qualified they are, how well they do in medical school. All that really matters here is the color of their skin. Which I don't know about you, but that's about the last thing I give a crap about when I'm in the hospital in need of medical attention. But that was the argument filed in court and given for why colleges and universities should admit people based on their race. And to the race baiters here who claim that Black babies are just dying in droves at the hands of white doctors who don't care if minority children make it out of the labor and delivery unit, that was just too good. You could almost see them salivating over this study. I mean, the idea that Black children are dying from, being cared for by white doctors was excellent news for these people, because it was used to fuel a narrative, and we're going to get to how that was literally the goal in just a minute, because it turns out, okay, that on top of being a very convenient political prop at the time, and continues to be to this day, it also wasn't true. Not even a little bit. So in September of last year, which was about 6 months ago, by the way, there was an updated study that, of course, never actually had a prayer of seeing the light of day. It was not championed nearly as loudly as the original lie, which is probably why you've never heard it. A reanalysis of this same exact data showed that when adjusted for other relevant factors, the race of the doctor overseeing a child's birth had, quote, an insignificant effect on a Black baby's survivability compared to a white baby. Let me explain. So this new study was conducted by 2 Harvard researchers at the Institute for Family Studies, and it found that the original 2020 study did not control for the impact of very low birth weights, under 1,500 grams, on newborn mortality, which, by the way, is about 3.3 pounds. That is an incredibly small baby, mostly due to being born extremely premature. There are other factors that can cause extremely low birth weight, but for the most part, it's when a baby is born extremely immaturely or prematurely. Now, you would think that this would be a very relevant factor if you're genuinely trying to figure out why babies are dying, if that's your actual goal here. In fact, studies have found that infants with extremely low birth rates beneath 1,500 grams or 3.3 pounds are 200 times more likely to die in their first year of life. Seems like a pretty relevant factor to me. So the Harvard team that looked at this same exact data as the George Mason team had found, quote, although these types of births are rare, they occur more frequently in the Black population, and they account for a very high fraction of mortality. Now, we don't know why this is, by the way. People who blame racism for absolutely every bad thing in the world would have you believe that, Black people are mistreated. They experience far more obstacles to things like good nutrition. They're under such physical and mental and emotional stress from all of the systemic racism that they're stuck in, that their babies are just being born too early and they weigh too little, and that's all the explanation that we need, because again, that supports the narrative. When in fact, multiple studies have been conducted over the years to try to puzzle this one out. We still aren't entirely sure why this tends to disproportionately affect the Black population. There was one study published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1997 that found that things like urban poverty was a known factor for low birth rate, which, by the way, would affect more than just the black population. But there were other things like the tendency to, among certain cultures, to have children at an earlier age, childbearing age, as well as smoking, also tended to impact birth weight. There was another study in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology published in 2008 that said genetics were likely to blame, that decreased birth weight in African American newborns is due to lower lean body mass and not fat mass. So the bottom line here is we're still not entirely sure why extremely low birth rate weight among newborns is higher among the black population. It's still very rare, but it does happen, and it happens at a higher rate than in the white population. But when it comes to infant mortality, if you're going to really take a look at that in any kind of an honest way, it's a really important factor to consider. So here's what the Harvard team found when they actually dug into the data without just trying to, churn out some predetermined outcome they had already decided that they wanted. Here's what the actual data showed. Quote, "It turns out that a disproportionately large number of black newborns with very low birth weights are attended by white physicians. We show that once we control for the impact of very low birth weights on mortality, the estimate of the racial concordance effect is substantially weakened and becomes statistically insignificant in models that account for other factors that determine newborn mortality. In other words, the newborns attended by white and black physicians are not random samples. Black newborns with a very low birth weight are disproportionately more likely to be attended by white doctors than by black doctors. Those newborns are also more likely to have a low chance of survival." In other words, these babies aren't dying because their doctors are white. These babies died because they were born too early, weighing too little, and were already very ill. It just so happens that more white doctors are caring for black children born with these factors, which I guess is a detail that is very conveniently overlooked and disregarded by somebody who, say, is out to link evil white men with the suffering of black communities, which, according to the original research author's own admission, seems to be exactly what happened. So this study, Debunking the original study, was published about 6 months ago in September of 2024. Here's why we're just now talking about it today. According to the Daily Caller News Foundation, and this is new, all right? This is new information that sort of sheds light on all of this. So we have the original study, we have the study that came out that debunked it, that didn't get nearly as much airtime. Here's what we now know. There was a note written in the margin of the original George Mason study by the lead author, Brad Greenwood, that shows that he knowingly admitted his own study's findings that white children were also more likely to die under the care of a black doctor, just as black children were more likely to die under the care of a white doctor. Isn't that interesting? All right. So the Daily Caller News Foundation got their hands on an unpublished draft of this study that had a note written in the margin of a section that showed, quote, "White newborns experience 80 deaths per 100,000 births more than a black physician than a white physician, implying a 22% fatality reduction from racial concordance." In other words, the study also found that white children were more likely to die under the care of black doctors than the other way around. So if you're looking for a purely racial angle here, that would have been just as relevant as the fact that black children were dying under the care of white doctors, don't you think? But see, that would have taken the focus off of the very specific racial angle that Greenwood apparently wanted, which is why that detail never made it into the study. He wanted a study that showed that black children were suffering at the hands of white doctors. That was the goal. The note that the Daily Caller News Foundation found in the margin of the unpublished draft of this original study, Greenwood had written, "I'd rather not focus on this," talking about the mortality rates of white children with black doctors. "If we're telling the story from the perspective of saving black infants, this undermines the narrative." There was a narrative that he wanted to push. There was an agenda here. It wasn't about empirical data. It wasn't about actually getting to the heart of why infants were dying. It was about supporting a racial narrative against white doctors that Greenwood had already decided he wanted. So the entire point, by his own admission, was to focus on how white doctors, these supposedly racist white doctors, were somehow responsible for neglecting or denying quality medical care to black children, resulting in their death. Never mind that white children were also disproportionately dying under the care of black doctors. Nobody cared about that. That wasn't pertinent to the narrative. So they just cut that part out. Greenwood just omitted that part. Black children are being killed by racist white doctors because the American medical system is rigged against minorities. That was the story. That was the goal. So we're just going to scratch the data and the parts of it that we don't like, that don't support that. Greenwood also wrote in a 2019 email to his colleagues that he had caught and fixed a coding error in his research, where he had apparently either misread or misinterpreted some of the medical codes that are affixed to a patient's file. He wrote, quote, "Good news. I caught my obligatory coding error. Updated results are attached. Bad news, results are not as strong. We lose the effect when a physician fixed effect is included for newborns." So the ranking of what should have just been straight empirical findings as either good or bad news suggests, again, Greenwood had a prefixed outcome in his mind for this study, and he was not happy when he had to grapple with data that didn't support it, which is not what scientists and researchers that are actually interested in the truth do. You learn in 6th grade science, okay, that you can start with a hypothesis, but then you go on with your experiment. You don't manipulate the process or alter your results or the data or your findings to give you whatever outcome you were hoping for or betting on, which is exactly what we saw during COVID when Dr. Deborah Birx ultimately admitted that the NIH was manipulating data in order to forcibly modify public behavior to reflect what these health experts all wanted us to do. And that's exactly what happened here. And the result was this biased study that completely overlooked all of these other relevant factors like low birth weight, and omitted inconvenient findings like the fact that white babies were also being disproportionately affected here. And it ultimately came to an incorrect conclusion, all to support a predetermined race-based outcome to fuel a narrative. And it was picked up and published by every major news outlet and the World Economic Forum, and it became a rallying cry for mass protests and made it all the way into a written opinion by a sitting Supreme Court justice, granted one who can't even define what a woman is, but still. And it was all total bullcrap. And I have to ask how much you actually care about saving the lives of black children if you aren't even willing to look for the real reason why they're dying. You're too busy blaming racism for everything. I mean, black children are still being born prematurely with low birth weights, and rather than figure out why and try to come up with ways to prevent that, you're spending your time hating white people and blaming them for every bad thing on the earth planet. This is what this obsession with race and race baiting gets you. And even still, this lie persists among people who want to use it to, again, fuel their narrative, given that the Harvard analysis that debunked this original 2020 study was published all the way back in September of last year and is just now making the rounds on social media 6+ months later. It proves just how insidious these lies can be and how permanently they can become ingrained in people's minds and into our social consciousness, especially when they just keep the fires of racism burning, which is the entire point. And you can't help but wonder when you read stuff like this, okay, if you're lucky enough to see it, because God knows CNN is not going to run some primetime story or publish a homepage headliner saying, whoops, this study that we pushed so hard a couple of years ago was debunked. We're sorry, we messed up. Here's the truth, inconvenient to our narrative as it may be. And you can't help but wonder just how many times we have been lied to by the so-called experts and the scientific community and the journalists and all of these people that we're supposed to trust to give us current information upon which to structure our lives and base our decisions. Here's what the data says so you can make an informed choice. And it seems that that is far too much to ask these days, whether it's for your own health or your medical care, or what decisions you should make for, your baby or your aging parent, what food you should buy, what schools you should send your kids to, whatever. All of these decisions based on information that you gather from what are supposed to be unbiased and reliable sources. Whether any of us actually want to or not, you can say that you live under a rock and that none of this applies to you and you don't believe anybody. But unfortunately, we are all impacted when science and data that should be unbiased, should be nothing but the facts, gets twisted to serve a narrative, because it then fuels social behaviors, which is the point. I mean, before the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, there were students who should have gotten into some of these universities but didn't, because schools were prioritizing the color of someone's skin over their merit because of bullcrap studies like this that told us that we need to fight back against systemic racism that turns out didn't even exist. I mean, this study was blasted out over every single major media outlet. I'm looking at dozens of them right now. And there were professional activists who used it and other bogus claims to gin up racial hatred and fuel riots that ended up destroying actual people's businesses and left bodies in the street, all based on this idiotic notion that white America is out to kill black people, as if we've got nothing better to do with our time. I mean, there might be black women who sought out black obstetricians over potentially more qualified white ones simply because they saw this story and truly believed that a white doctor was more likely to kill their child. This stuff has a real world impact, and we'll probably never know the true extent of it. All because one guy in some ivory tower somewhere had a political bent and a angle to push and decided that his preferred narrative was more important than the truth. And the problem, perhaps even greater than the experts lying to us, is the fact that we have a media that is completely uninterested in actually uncovering the truth before they just fling something out there and report it as concrete fact without even bothering to, check to see if it's accurate first. Because the clicks and the agenda are far more important. Also this week, as you may have seen, there was a big story that broke out of Georgia that went viral on social media about a man who was arrested by the police after leaving his 3 children, ages 10, 6, and 1, at a McDonald's play place for nearly 2 hours by themselves. So this happened at a McDonald's in Augusta, Georgia, and another customer noticed that this guy had left the building and he didn't come back, and these 3 kids, one of whom was a toddler at most, were all alone. And so he called the police, and the police showed up, and eventually the kids were taken to their mother. And so when 24-year-old Chris Lewis showed back up about 2 hours later, he was, of course, immediately arrested, and he was charged with deprivation of a minor, because I don't know who needs to hear this today, but it is a crime to leave your very young underage children at a fast food restaurant playground. Okay, kind of standard practice here. But see, 24-year-old Chris Lewis is a black man. So standard practice that would apply to anybody turns into claims of racial bias against him. So when he was arrested, Lewis told the cops that he didn't have a car and that he had walked with his kids from his apartment to the McDonald's, and that he didn't want to make them walk all the way back to his apartment, and he had a job interview nearby, so he left them at the McDonald's where he thought that they would be safe, which was the only angle that the media wanted to run with. So here's this poor black man with these 3 young kids, and he's just trying to get a job and, provide for his family. And yeah, he left his 2 elementary age kids and his baby alone in a McDonald's, but he had a good reason, and we should probably give him a pass. He's just a working man trying to make a buck, and childcare is so hard to come by. And this sob story made the rounds on social media and picked up steam and made it all the way to former Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver Antonio Brown, who launched this story into the stratosphere on the internet, and who even created a GoFundMe to support Lewis, calling him a dad just trying to find a way to make some money for his family. Antonio Brown wrote, quote, "I know he shouldn't just leave his kids, but some people don't have the means for babysitting, etc." Because apparently that's a good enough reason to just leave your 3 kids, including a baby, at a McDonald's. So the GoFundMe that he set up had a goal of about $55,000. It had raised nearly $62,000 as of Wednesday night and was still active. Arthur Watkins, who chairs the Freedmen Reparations Trust Fund, wrote a letter to the Augusta District Attorney, Jared Williams, demanding the dismissal of all charges against Lewis on the grounds that poverty is not a crime and that survival should not be prosecuted. And all of this just evoked all of this sympathy for this guy. Droves of people coming out of the woodwork to defend him. Here's a poor black man just trying to better his life, and here's the popo throwing the book at him for it. Typical racist justice system coming down on a black man just trying to do good by his kids. Because apparently having a family member or a friend watch your kids while you duck out for a job interview is mission impossible here. I'm thinking that just about anything is probably better than leaving your young children and your baby at a playground by themselves for 2 hours, except maybe, I don't know, leaving them in the middle of the highway might be a little bit worse. But this is probably about the dumbest thing that you could possibly do. You're telling me you didn't have any other options? Well, come to find out, okay, after all of this, the guy was lying. Shocker. Absolute shocker. Bro was lying about having a job interview that he was supposedly at while his 3 children were unattended. Turns out Lewis did fill out an application, and he had an informal job interview, i.e. he talked to somebody for 5 minutes. But all of that had taken place hours before he ever took these kids to McDonald's. So there was a police report that was written, not that the media waited to see what was in that before running with this story. But according to the police report, Lewis was not at a job interview when these children were left unattended. The police report states that Lewis's 10-year-old, who was left in charge of her 2 young siblings at the McDonald's, told an officer that her father often left them alone and that he had told her he was leaving to drop off a backpack before he took off. Now, I don't know why he would have been dropping off a backpack and it would have taken him 2 hours to do so and justified him leaving his 3 children alone at a McDonald's. I'm not saying I know why. I'm just saying that I could make a pretty educated guess as to why. And it probably wasn't that he was going to talk to the local Piggly Wiggly manager about the assistant manager position. I'm just throwing that out there. So God only knows what he was doing for the hour and 42 minutes that he was out and about. Okay, I'll leave that up to you to speculate. But see, none of that mattered. And waiting for the actual truth didn't matter. Gathering the facts didn't matter. What mattered to the media, what mattered to race baiting people over on social media, what mattered to the reparations mob was this sob story that just goes to show how even the hardest working, most honest of black men just cannot catch a break. That the justice system is rigged against them. And, by the way, side note, maybe if the government would just pay for all of our child care, we wouldn't have this problem of people needing to get to job interviews and having to leave their kids unattended in the ball pit for 2 hours just so they can earn a paycheck. That's all that mattered. That was the goal. Just like, digging around for any shred of proof that you can find that all of these mean white doctors are killing black babies and throwing out anything that doesn't support that theory. That was the goal. They want us to hate one another. That is the point. It is not about saving the lives of black babies. If the lives of black babies actually mattered to the left, then they would care an awful lot about black babies being disproportionately and brutally slaughtered every single year in abortion clinics to the tune of thousands a week. Okay, this isn't about making sure that babies are saved. This isn't about making sure that working parents are supported. This is about stoking division. They want black people to genuinely believe to their soul that white people hate them and are out to get them and to make their lives miserable. They want poor people to believe that anybody who is even marginally successful or has 2 dimes to rub together is the root of all of their problems. All of this fuels the victimhood narrative that they need to keep poor people and minorities stuck in this cycle of dependence. Everyone is out to get you, and you need the government to save you, to make sure that you get into college, to make sure that you get quality health care, but that you don't actually have to pay for it, to make sure that whatever stupid decisions you make or whatever crimes you want to commit, you don't actually get held responsible for those, no matter who you put at risk, no matter who you victimize, no matter how many children are harmed. The system cannot hold you accountable because ultimately you are the real victim here. That's the point. That's the goal. And they will push any lie, any bunch of manipulated data, any skewed research, any inaccurate news story in order to support it. The lie is not an accident. These are not mistakes that are being made. This is purposeful. In fact, it's the whole point. And with that, that's the Brittany Hughes Show for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll be back here next Thursday. In the meantime, head over to the Brittany Hughes Show so that you won't ever miss an episode. You can hit the subscribe button on the Apple Podcast button. That way, you can catch us every single week. While you are over there, you should also subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast with Tim Graham. That one's on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. You don't want to miss it. Got lots of stuff for you to load up on your phone and listen as you go to and from work, picking up the kids from school, whatever. I will see you guys back here next Thursday. I hope you will join me. In the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic week and a blessed weekend.